Hey team, welcome back to the Microforge. I'm Albert, and on today's video, I'm going to be showing you how I built this display board for my Arnor army. We're going to be talking composition, the build process, how to paint it, but probably most importantly, how I go about infusing theme and storytelling whenever I'm designing a display board or a terrain piece like this. We'll be using some pretty familiar pieces from the Slice and Slot range, as well as a new addition, the Domed Roof. So check out our My Mini Factory store for that one if you're keen to grab your hands on that one as well. Also, make sure you stay tuned to the end of the video where I announce the winner of last video's giveaway for these MDF jigs. No, I haven't forgotten about them, and yes, it's taken a long time, but that's enough talking, let's get into it.
Usually, I don't like planning out my builds, but when it comes to a display board and working to a tight time frame, planning is your friend. So I need a board that can fit 40 plus models, and it needs to look like a slice of the city of Fornost. Because we have 40 models, we're going to need to have an upper and a lower ground to better see all the models in the army. I've made part of the top level on an angle and part parallel to the board edge. Part of this is to create a more dynamic composition and feel less like a stacked layer cake, and part of it is because there weren't many right angles when it came to medieval urban design. Obviously, we're going to need some stairs to connect the two levels, and then a way to bookend the corners of the board visually. So we'll do this by creating two buildings. One will be a tall tower on the left-hand side, and a second will be a shorter pergola. Again, having buildings of different sizes will help to create a bit more variety in the composition. Now, with the planning done, let's get into the build. I've cut down a piece of 3mm thick MDF to 25 centimeters by 35 centimeters. To create the different levels, I'm going to use some of my cheap, unwanted green XPS foam. This stuff is garbage for carving detail into, but it works really well just to pad out the build. I'm using a combination of hot glue and PVA to glue these in place. The thinking being that where air can get to the PVA, I'll put that around the edges, and to the center of the foam where air probably won't be able to evaporate that PVA, I'll just use some hot glue. This way it also tacks it in place and speeds up the build process. As you can see, I've gone ahead and carved out some stonework for the walls so we can hide all of that rubbish green foam. If you want more details on how I approach carving my stone walls, feel free to go back to one of our earlier videos to check out that process. Again, I'm using a combination of hot glue to tack this piece in place and some PVA glue just to make sure that it's got a really strong, long-lasting bond to it. Then it's on to crafting the stairs. Now, the stairs are a pretty straightforward process. All I'm going to use is a series of 5mm thick layers of XPS foam. Each step will be about 5mm wide, so each layer I just cut 5mm shorter than the previous. Hopefully that makes sense. This is a pretty straightforward process, and because we aren't going to see the edges of it, it really doesn't matter that we're just stacking these pieces up one on top of one another. I actually really enjoyed doing these cobblestones. I'm using a mix of 20 by 20, 10 by 20, and 10 by 10 mil flagstones. They've all been pre-textured, and I'm aligning them to the angled wall. Again, this is to create a little bit more sense of movement in the piece. If they were aligned along the straight edge, it would feel a bit more static. You'll notice that a lot of them are hanging over the edge, and once that is dry, I can just come back in with a sharp hobby knife and trim those all down to size. Now we can do the front of the walls. I want to do what we would call a blind arcade. So a series of archways connected together, that's what you would call an arcade. When it sits hard up against a wall, you call it a blind arcade. To get this effect, I've taken some of the culvert pieces from the base range of Slice and Slot, and I've just cut with a hobby saw the back face of the stonework, so that'll sit flush against the wall that we have already on the display board. Using the usual process of gluing these in place with some 2-part epoxy, it's pretty straightforward. And once we've got all of the arches, it's time to glue in the columns. The columns get a small 1.5mm hole drilled in them, and that will fit a barbecue cocktail skewer, which gives this whole connection a much stronger join. I'm using the surface of the cutting mat here to make sure that it lies as flat as possible, because when this is all glued together, it will sit hard up against the wall, which you'll see in just a moment. So to glue these in place, we're going to use PVA as much as possible to create a really strong join. Once they're all sitting where I want them to, I come in with some pins and just secure them to make sure that they dry in the correct place. Once that's all dry, I noticed that the back face of the arcade was just showing up a little bit. So to cover this up, I've just got a very small strip of 5x5mm XPS foam, and that will add a little bit more detail. It's almost like a little curb channel, things like this, you know, covering up your mistakes. There's no such thing as mistakes, just happy little accidents. To finish off this wall piece, I want to add on some capping. I did think about using some Slice and Slot capping, which would look great, but sometimes it's faster and easier and looks just as nice to do it in some foam. So here I'm just using some foam that's slightly thicker than the thickness of the wall, so probably 12 to 15mm wide, and it's 5mm thick. So it just creates enough separation between the wall and makes it feel a little bit more finished. You can see here I am gluing them all in place and then trimming them down to the size. That way I get a really nice clean finish when these pieces are turning the corner. Then I just come back in with a pencil and mark out where I want to break up the stonework and cut that in with my X-Acto blade, and then go back over it with that pencil to just make sure that that line is deep enough to read as separate brickwork. If there are any areas that feel a bit flat and untextured, you can always come back in with your tinfoil ball and just roughen up those edges a little bit more. With the majority of the base build done, I come back in with my dirt mixture. Now this is a mix of coffee grounds, dirt from the garden, and of course some tile grout. I'm sprinkling this over all of the cobblestones just to fill in any gaps where they are a little bit too large and you can see through to that green foam. I sprinkle it on and then I brush it around with just one of my terrain brushes to make sure that it's just sitting in the cracks and most of it is off the actual surface of the cobblestones. I mismeasured my stairs and there's a pretty egregious gap between the walls and the edge of the stairs, but that's fine. I took the dirt mix and added a whole bunch of PVA to create this kind of slurry, and I'm just jamming this in the gaps here. I'll come back once all of that is filled in with a little throwaway paintbrush that I always have on hand. It's always good to have some cheap brushes, some synthetics. I pick mine up on Wish or Temu or one of those kind of sites, and I just come in and feather out the edge so that this looks like it's just a buildup of dirt and grime in the corner of that staircase. Now it's time to do the buildings. Now here's a little trick in terms of composition. If you want a tower to look taller, put the windows on the upper levels higher up. So you see here I swapped it around and took 20mm off the top and then slid it underneath those windows. By doing it that way, the tower will eventually feel a little bit taller than if I had have just kept it the way it was. This is all a pretty straightforward process that you've seen me do on the channel before, so do go and check out some of our previous videos to get the lowdown on how I carve this stonework and insert the slice and slot windows. I'm using 2 smaller windows for the upper levels and then 2 larger windows for the bottom levels. Again, this kind of helps to make the building feel like it's slightly taller. When I reconnect all of these walls, I like to lay them all flat on my cutting mat. That way they get as close to being straight as possible. To add a little bit of extra variation, I put in some buttresses in between the windows. And again, this will help to accentuate the verticality of the tower and make it feel a little bit taller. So I've got one wall here and we just need to replicate the same design again on the other side. And then I've cut out a corner buttress, which is slightly thicker than the dimensions of the wall. So about 15mm thick as opposed to the walls, which are all 10mm thick. And then I just glue this one into place. And by doing it this way, you can trick the eye into thinking that this is a proper masonry wall and you don't end up with any unsightly joins at the corner. With everything glued in place, I've sprayed the back face black at this point because I know that I won't have access to this after this stage. I've also measured out the corner to align to the actual display board, so these pieces will help it sit flush in that corner. I glue those into place, just using some hot glue. And this bottom piece is cut out smaller so that you won't see it when it's all assembled and it won't interfere with any of those slice and slot windows that are at the ground floor there. Then I've cut out a piece of 1mm thick cardstock. I have measured this to the correct length and I just score a line at the corner so that I can bend this around as a single piece and it creates a really clean edge capping for this building. So again, just a bit of hot glue around the edge here to hold it all in place. This doesn't need to be a super strong bond, so hot glue will get the job done quickly and we can keep on progressing with the build. Now here's a familiar piece. You would have seen this pavilion piece in a previous slice and slot video. I have approached the corner detail slightly differently though. So you can see there, I've just cut these wall pieces out to be the same width as the MDF jig, and then I'm placing in a separate corner piece. I want to try and create something of a more elaborate corner. Because this is in the palace forecourt, I figure this would be quite a decorated architecture piece. So you can see here, I'm just scoring in a line as a continuation of that brick arch geometry, and that helps to accentuate that corner piece. This is fairly delicate work. Just make sure that you don't overcut and cut too much of the foam off, because you can always take away more foam if you don't cut off enough, but you can't put foam back on. When I was doing this, I did stuff up a couple of cuts by trying to rush it, so always make sure that you take your time and just score this one off. So I'm removing 5mm roughly off the corner here, and that will help to create something of a negative kind of detail on the corner there. So you can see I've just taken off that 5mm worth of material, then I just very gently score in a line for some of the stonework so that it reads as the same material as the rest of the foam in this part of the build. And there we go. Then I'm going to put the hat on top. So this is just going to provide a stable base for the domed roof. I have pre-textured that, and then I have pre-measured out the dome so that it should sit perfectly aligned with the stonework that I've carved in. If you're keen to get your hands on this dome, it is up on our My Mini Factory store, so go and check the description below for the link for that one. And here we go, the build is finished. As you can see, I got a bit excited and already got into the painting of the base build, but this was a time crunch of a project. So some of the things I had to do off camera and just make sure I got things done. Now it's on to the painting stage, and because time is of the essence, I'm going to use this foam safe spray paint from Army Painter. This is just going to give me a nice dark coat. It's what I coated the baseboard in, and here you can see me just spraying it on all of the buildings to give it a nice thick coating. Usually I always cover my pieces in Mod Podge and paint mix, but as this is going to be a display board, I'm less worried about its durability because it will be only used really for display purposes. Now, the painting technique is pretty similar to what I've covered in my previous videos. So I switch over to the airbrush and basically apply a mid-grey zenithal spray, being pretty liberal with it to cover as much as possible. I don't want to have everything exactly evenly covered, so a little bit of patchiness is fine because it'll just add to the variation of the stonework in the end, so that's fine. This time I did some pre-weathering before I even picked up my dry brush. The thinking here is that there isn't any other greenery to kind of break up this cityscape scene. So adding in some greens and some browns and some kind of mold and residue on the bricks and around the corners of the walls will help to break up the monotony of it just feeling like one big grey blob of a mass. Now, one thing we haven't talked about yet is the story behind this board. The display board was built for a local Middle-earth strategy battle game tournament that had a strong focus on theme. And for my army, I was taking Arnor, but a very specific time period in Arnor's history. For those that aren't as steeped in the lore of the Lord of the Rings, and trust me, I by no means count myself a learned historian, but I do have a passing knowledge of Arnor. See, Arnor was in the north, and it was the sister kingdom to Gondor in the south, which we see in the movies. Arnor was in fact the seat of the High King Elendil during the Second Age, and during the early part of the Third Age, Arnor split into 3 smaller kingdoms due to a dispute in the line of succession. There was Arthedain in the north, Cardolan to the south, and Rhudaur to the east. Each kingdom claimed that their right to rule was the most just and resulted in years of infighting, bickering, border disputes and skirmishes which ultimately weakened Arnor as a whole. Add in a plague that killed much of the populace, the Witch King rising to power and openly assaulting each of the kingdoms, and it's easy to see why Arnor fell into such a ruined state. Now, fast forward to the year 1349 of the Third Age, King Arbeleg I has inherited the throne of Arthedain, and he moves to reunite Arnor. The royal line of Cardolan has been assassinated and decimated by the Witch King, and Arbeleg believes his bloodline to be the only left with the direct lineage from the High Kings of old. It is in this moment that the kingdom of Rhudaur reveal the full extent of their treachery, refusing Arveleg's claim to the throne and openly declaring their alliance with the Witch King, raiding from the east. In this dire hour, Arveleg manages to reunite Cardolan and Arthedain, and this display board represents the moment when the last of the Cardolan nobility travel to Fornost in the north, the capital of Arthedain, to swear their allegiance to the new king. The only thing to note whilst I've been waxing lyrical is I felt like there wasn't enough variation in the stonework, so I cracked out a whole bunch of the Citadel washes and just picked out individual stones to try and break up the monotony of the grey stonework. Once I had put all of these down, and I put them down in varying levels of intensity, so you'll see that I kind of come back and forth and water them down slightly. Once it's all dry, I do a final dry brush with a very light bone color to essentially knock back the intensity slightly and make it all feel a little bit more unified. I took a very similar approach painting all of the buildings. The only thing to note that I did differently was to pick out the tiles on this domed roof. I was going for a pretty muted bluey grey tone, and I just layered up successive highlights. I was pretty aggressive with the contrast here. Because it is a terrain piece, you do want to push that contrast a little bit higher than you would on a model, just to make it feel like it has the right amount of impact and visual interest as well. But with all of that now done, let's finally get to the grand reveal. So there we go, guys. I was super stoked to finish this one off in time for the tournament. One last thing to note is that placing your models can also help to really sell the story of what you're trying to tell, and I thought for quite a while about how I wanted to stage the last king of Arnor, welcoming in the remnants from Cardolan, and I was really happy with the way that this scene all came together. Make sure to give the video a like, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing so that it can motivate me to get these videos happening a little bit more frequently. I love making them, but unfortunately it's just finding the time to actually get down and film things. Anyway, with that said, guys, have fun hobbying.
Now, some of you are thinking, Albert, you've forgotten your giveaway, haven't you? And, well, yes, I definitely forgot my giveaway, but I remembered at the last moment. So, congratulations goes to Tom GMCC. Tom, wherever you are in the world, reach out to us on Facebook, Instagram, here on YouTube, or any other platform that you find us on, and we will make sure that that jig goes out to you. So congratulations.